2 Empirical Approach. Contents: 2.1 Introduction, 2.2 Empirical Approach, 2.3 Rules of Data Collection, 2.4 Cultural Relativism, 2.5 Problems Encountered in Data Collection, 2.6 Differences between Common Sense and Science, 2.7 What is Ethical, 2.8 What is Normal, 2.9 Understanding the Data Collected, 2.10 Managing Diversities in Social Research, 2.11 Problematizing the Object of Study, 2.12 Conclusion, Return to Good Old Empirical Approach. Learning Objectives. It is expected that after reading this unit, you will be able to answer the following questions. What is empirical research? How to collect data with rules in mind? How to explain the concept of cultural relativism? What are the problems encountered while collecting data? What are the issues of ethical and normal viewpoints in social research? How does one understand the facts collected? How does one problematize the object of study? How is one to manage diversities in social research? 2.1 Introduction. In Unit 1, we discussed the tension between giving primacy to ideas and logical understanding of society and to empiricism that relies on observable facts. As already mentioned in Unit 1, to the extent the sociological theories need to be based on observations of the social world, you can regard empiricism to be at the center of the modern scientific method. In Unit 5 and 6, you will read more about such proponents of empirical research as Francis Bacon, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. Empiricism refers to the view that experience, particularity of senses, is the object source of knowledge. This view of empiricism has been contrasted with rationalism, which holds that all the knowledge is based on introspection and a priori, as far as one knows, deducting reasoning. Such a contrast and the ensuing debate held for quite some time the interest of many philosophers and classical sociologists, whether supporting total adherence to empiricism or not. Social scientists never gave up their abiding interest in the empirical approach to social research. In Unit 2, we will be discussing what is meant by empirical approach and how the data for the social research is to be collected with certain rules in mind. Further, we will discuss the various problems encountered in the application of the empirical approach and conclude with the observation that while it is necessary to look at the social reality, it is also important to find out how it came to be so. When it comes to determining the object of one's study, social scientists have come to recognize that we need to investigate power, relationships, and their formations, including the subject position of the scholar engaged in the research. Reading this through the various sections of this unit, you would be able to appreciate the inevitable empirical orientation of social science research and at the same time the requirement of handling diverse points of view in it. 2.2 Empirical Approach. Let us also clarify at the outset that you will find many supporters of empiricism, while there are enough social scientists who follow the empirical approach without subscribing to empiricism. This means that they do not accept the theoretical premises of empiricism and do not like to support it in a doctrine. All the same time, they find it acceptable to follow the empirical approach as a methodology. This is why you find here our discussion of empirical approach. Empirical approach refers to the methodology of collecting facts through observations and other first-hand methods of data collection. There is a difference of opinion and method in whether one relies on the data collected only by a particular method designed as a scientific or on a data collected by any layperson. In the initial period of the growth of the social sciences, scholars such as Herbert Spencer, Auguste Comte, and even Edward Tyler, and Lewis Henry Morgan, depend largely on the data collected by travelers, missionaries, and administrators passing through various territories. The emphasis at this time was on the logical process of analysis. The data served only to illustrate the ideas and fill in the schema. Some whose origin lay in the brain of the armchair scholars. The scholars relied on their own intuitive judgment to select data and to compare them. Against such practices came up the insistence on scientific collection of data, with some rules to be strictly followed if one was to claim authenticity of the fact gathered. 2.3 Rules of Data Collection. Durkheim, in his Rules of Sociological Method, first published in 1985, recognized that the data must be collected not just anyhow but keep certain rules in mind. As Durkheim perceived it, social phenomena must have an external existence and must be treated separate from the representations of them in the mind. Descartes, in his book Meditations on the First Philosophy, first published in 1641, English translation published in 1991, laid the basis of the scientific method by the simple rule of doubt and advanced the strategy of beginning by doubting the truth of everything. You can say that in the same spirit, a true scientific approach does not accept anything without proof, and this discounts must be second-hand data relied upon the armchair scholars. Also, scientists rely on data collected explicitly for the goals of the scientific endeavor, collecting data in a overall methodology of science and cannot be disassociated from the process of understanding. This step takes us further to considering the issues of collecting data without pre-existing bias that we may have in our minds. 2.4 Cultural Relativism. Further, the notion that the collection of data must be done without any subjective understanding, preconceived notions of prejudices came up. The dictum that the scientist must remain ethically and emotionally neutral. The rule of cultural relativism is the outcome of such mindset. For one must accept whatsoever does not belong to one's own culture is not wrong or strange. The principle of getting on ethnocentrism, or regarding only one's own conceptions and values as proper, is something that is taught to all students of social sciences, but it is not most difficult to overcome. I give one instance for my own field experience. While on the field work to be interior villages of that look like place in this religion, and bride was older in age to the groom. While talking to one man whose wife was 8 years older to him and whom he seemed to love very much, I asked a rather foolish but not to be at that time obvious question: why are the women older to their husbands? The man looked at me in surprise and asked a counter question: are they not in your community? And seemed surprisingly when I told him that they were almost invariably younger. His surprise made me realize that ingrained nature of our values and how difficult it is to overcome them, as we tend to take many things that are common in our own culture as natural rather than social. Similarly, Margaret met in her work Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies had undermined all notions of femininity and masculinity held as neutral in Western societies. My own classmates went into squeals of laughter when I described the men in their curls and makeup flirting with the plain-looking women of the Chabuli, New Guinea. Whether or not Mead's election we were correct, They understood, dispelled the myth of what is neutral. Box 2.1. Margaret Mead's study of Takabuli's culture. In December 1931, Margaret traveled to New Guinea to study the Arpesh and later the Madugomor and Tachabuli cultures. Here her fieldwork consists of studying sex roles in culture. Mead found that in Arpesh culture both men and women were expected to be equal. This culture was found to be very simple as both genders actively raising the children. On the other hand, Madugomor culture was very fierce. Both men and women are mean and aggressive. Often the children were left to fend for themselves, and infants on the wrong sex were commonly cast into the river to die. This in itself was a very alarming experience for Margaret. In Tachamuli culture, Margaret found that the sex roles was diverse. The women are brisk and hearty, and the men were in the charge of the household. These cultures differences were then published in both books, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. The objectivity that Durkheim had aspired to introduce into the social sciences presumed that the things could be identified according to their extensive observable character, and that it was also possible to classify similar phenomena. A very important dimension of classifying was how one defined a certain trait or institution. Many a time a feature may remain invisible or unrecognized if one looks for superficial resemblance only. In this sense, the definition of external visibility is to be exercised with the caution. For example, the early anthropologists could not locate anything resembling a political institutions among the so-called primitive societies. But later, with their seminal work, African political systems, Fortes and Evans Pritchard recognized the political as embedded in other social institutions such as kinship, and they identified it not by its overt form but by its function. Durkheim undertook the analytical task of apprehending a mode of classification. In this essay, Primitive Classification, Durkheim and Mauss distinguished symbolic classification of moral or religious nature from practical schemes of technological distinctions. At the end of his introductions to Durkheim and Mauss's essay, Needham says, "It is the cardinal achievement of Durkheim and Mauss' essay, with all its imperfections, to have conceived the analytical notion of classification in sociological inquiry." 2.5. Problems encountered in data collection. You may say that the scientific approach or even the social scientist approach is to accept something only by the way of its inherent properties and not by any ideas regarding it. However, as has been realized with respect to social data, such an observation without interpretations or the quest for inherent properties is an illusion. Everything about society follows a system of meaning bestowed on it by culture or by humans. For example, concepts like femininity, masculinity, etc. are all parts of meaning systems. There may be many societies where such terms hold one meaning, and in other they may mean quite different things. There is also the question of subjectivity, as to what extent we can remain objective as observers when something that we see evokes intense emotions in us as human beings. In the social sciences, the question has still not been resolved completely, but certainly many social scientists have abandoned the stand of neutrality, and you will find many scholar activities who consider it ethically wrong to remain neutral and emotionless when dealing with human situations. There is a recognition among such scholars that we can set up universal criteria such as universal concept of human rights to intervene in situations that we enter as observers. Sometimes the entry may be for the specific purpose of intervention, as in development studies or when social scientists are called in as advisors and consultants. But the debate whether to intervene or not to intervene is never ending. 2.6 Difference between common sense and science. If in the ultimate analysis that we need to rely upon is our sense perceptions of social, the major question is how to exercise the use of the scenery with the caution that no ideas should be formed independent of the sensory perception. This is the fundamental difference between common sense and science. The common sense views rely on the conceptions formed not necessarily with the reference to the scientific methods of causality. The nature science and the social sciences give more attention to the underlying causality rather than to superficial resemblance or lack of resemblance. It is for the scientist to look beyond individual manifestations to identify and classify phenomena. We need to consider the significant contribution of social science research to highlighting the false notions held by people about the social world. Such ideas often manifest themselves as prejudices and become a source of unnecessary social conflicts. Social science research findings, on the other hand, often tally with common held views, and in those cases social scientists appear to be talking rather common sense thing about social reality, because their findings becomes an integral part of the everyday stock of our knowledge. We have already considered the examples of political. It can be shown that as far as the functions of political is exercise of power or to negotiate such power differentials, it can be achieved through institutions and mechanisms that are necessary to identify as the family, kinships or religious rituals. All the same, a social scientist has to go beyond dispelling false notions about social reality. There are rather complex issues facing social sciences who have to invariably deal with not only what are obvious, well-known, routine matters, but also with digressive activities which you may call not normally and somewhat also not ethical. It is not easy to define what is the ethical and normal. Let us first discuss the issues of ethics relating to morals and then we take up the issues of normal. 2.7 What is ethical? Everything in society does not follow the same pattern. Whenever a social scientist observes actual human behavior and activities, there are always some differences of opinions about what is right and what is wrong. We have already discussed that the scientist in the one without any normal bias, such that what is right or wrong cannot be determined according to any particular realistic principles, such as one's own value system, but must have a universal reference. There has to be some universal criteria for well-being, such as health, life and so on, by which we may judge an actions to be right or wrong. But this is a question that has continued to be plugged the social sciences. By what criteria do we construct a universal code of morality or ethics? How do we reconcile the idea of cultural reality with the transcendence or ethnocentrism? For example, anthropologists have been accused of trying to find a justification for every custom found in any society, including human sacrifice and infanticide. It is still a very big question mark as how we judge the concept of right and wrong when they do not apply to us, as Barnes has put it. The intellectual task of natural scientists is greatly simplified because his data are, comparatively speaking, hard and reliable, and because the same between him and the natural phenomena has studied is clear cut. The social scientist, however, deals with the data that are usually unreliable and fuzzy, and more importantly his relations to the phenomena he studies in two sides. The people who studies not only talk but they also talk back to him. Consequently, it is his kind of science rather than that followed by a physicist or chemist that should be called hard if we wish to indicate the difficulty of the task he faces. Certainly, the same amount of success achieved so far in social sciences as compared to natural sciences suggests that social science is indeed a hard undertaking. Ethical problems constitute a major concept of its intrinsic difficulty. Ethical questions come up also for the natural sciences. For example, we are all aware of ethical questioning regarding weapons of mass destruction and genetic engineering, but as Laszlo and Wilbur pointed out, it is only after scientific discoveries affect the humankind that we racial ethical questions about natural sciences. Otherwise, humans as so much do not figure out into the theories of physics. In contrast to these situations in the social sciences, we are dealing with human being all the time, and that is why we are in social sciences have to continuously face ethical questions, and it is just not problem to ignore. At this juncture, it seems a good idea to compete in reflections and actions. 2.1 exercise appreciating the ethical problems in studying the social reality around us. Reflections and action 2.1. Read the excerpt given below from Taban about her field work in Rishi Valley School in 1981. Identify the nature of the problem in her field work. Discuss both its ethical and moral aspects in terms of not to betray participants and lose their goodwill and credibility in the field, and the trust and the confidence which has been placed in the ethnographer and in human beings is not usually possible to betray. In the light of your discussion, answer the following questions on a separate sheet of paper. The excerpt from Taban. It is the ethnographer who seeks to elicit the participant cooperation and has thus to take the initiative to negotiate, cajole, and use alternative strategies to tease out, as it were, information which is secret and therefore restricted. This may include presenting different problems to different kinds of participants, as I did, to make ones acceptable to the entire community and thereby eligible for receiving secret information. Success with participants depend on the ethnographer's ability to handle interactions in a manner that engenders confidence and trust. Such participants may, of course, decline to enter into interactions, and the ethnographer has no power to make them to do so. Once the ethnographer has obtained the information from others who become friends and informants, the balance of power shifts from the information to the ethnographer in as much as later may choose to use the information in any desired manner. Questions. Is it fair to drop some significant findings of research because of the feelings of betraying by informers in the field? Does the research really possess the kind of power she has after obtaining the sensitive and significant piece of information? Is it necessary that practical, moral, human considerations need to determine the ethnographer's use of material obtained during the course of research? The academic counselor is to please organize a debate on ethical and moral issues of social research and encourage the learning to articulate and express their views in this matter. Efforts may be made to record the discussions for broadcasting by Gyanavani. 2.8. What is normal? The other discussions to studying the social worlds relates to what is normative that conforms to the standard, regular, usual, typical pattern. The task is to decide what is normative and what is pathological. The decisions of what constitutes the normal is the moot point on which social sciences rest. In the earlier phases of social science research, a kind of society was taken for granted that was homogeneous, or everyone has the same values and norms, but increasingly it was realized that such a society was only the dream of ethnographers that exist particularly to human being without any differentiation, and this means that for different sections of society there may be varying values and points of view. And increasing the criticism arose with the rise of the feminist and also the subaltern and the third world perspective. It was increasingly brought to the notice of the leaders that what has been portrayed as normal and regulated was such only for a section of society, and even in the simplest society this was only world of men. Box 2.2 Restudy the Weiner. The path-breaking restudy of Malinowski's field, the Trobriand Island by a woman anthropologist Weiner, showed that what Malinowski had depicted as true for the entire Trobriand society was true only for the world of men. The world of men had women had been left out, as it did not exist, but it did and was an important dimensions of life on the Torbind Islands. Such considerations led to the revision of theoretical stances, including that is multiculturalism, that has now become an important dimension of social research in the context of global movement of people from one country to settle down into another country. Here we return to the scientific study of society and the assumptions and clarifications it entitled. Earlier, the evolutionary social scientists had assumed that it was possible to have a universal reference to judge the normal, and more importantly, there was nothing that was normal as compared to the pathological. The method to go about doing so would be social, but ultimately, as even Durkheim realized, one had to fall back on use of deductive logic. One way to look at a formal social phenomenon was to look for its distributions in various societies of the human species, and if one kind of phenomena is found in most communities in spite of having variable manifestations, it may take a normal as normal. For example, almost all human societies have some kind of grouping we can call as family. Thus, a family, or no matter what form, is usually supposed to be a normal conditions of human societies, and the breakdown of absence of these institutions may be taken pathological. This again indicates that there cannot be any truly objective and external conditions of normality. If normally is to be contextualized to its occurrences in different societies. However, while considering the differences of occurrence in space, one cannot overlook temporary distributions of a phenomenon. Again, raising the questions that what is normal at one point of time may not be so in the other historical period. For example, in the modern world, the term family may also denote a single parent family or a family with parents of the same sex. Certainly, such families would have been considered abnormal only a couple of decades back. In Durkheim's time, the variability in time and space were both explained by the concept of evolution, but today history has replaced evolution, making an important difference. Progress is no longer seen as an inbuilt mechanism of transformations in space. Just as we had the concept of cultural reality across space, the same can now be applied across time. We can truly be neutral about things that have happened and around about those that are going to happen. But as we have been time and again, such naturality is not humanly possible about something that is occurring is the present. The acceptance of human stability is the social science has ultimately given impetus to the emergence of the postmodern theory, about which you will read in later units of this book. The logical normality of which Durkheim 1968-55 spoke came under criticism as the logic of a particular observer, but Durkheim had been careful to point out to the extensive of cultural relativism to counter the universal laws of evolution posted by his predecessors such as Comte. He was also astute enough to separate the cause of existence of a phenomenon from its function a technology to which later expect generations of the functionalists often fail. This taken up the questions about how to make up the use of how to make use of this takes up a question about how to make sense of the facts collected during a research. 2.9 Understanding the data collected. For a beginner in the social sciences, the use of the empirical phenomena approach means the collection of data can be subjected to a theoretical analysis. Some kind of data have been rejected from the scientific purpose when the emphasis was on the homology between the natural sciences and the social sciences. For example, the data collected by travelers and missionaries was rejected, as also the recent rejected historical data. One could not take the reliability of such data from granted. There was a presumption that we could view society as a functional body that could be explained in terms of timeless laws like the functioning of a natural organism. The idea of social order was one such concept that sought to explain many things. So we are in the concept of systems and equilibrium. The only reliable data was one collected by trained social scientists in the field by themselves. Even for purpose of comparisons, one would legitimately refer only to the work of other social scientists and not to that of the laypersons, including the historians. In addition, as more and more observers entered the field, it became apparent that the role of the impersonal observer was almost a myth. The ranging debate between Margaret Head and Derek Freeman over the data of the sermons in a case in the point. The entry of the conflict theorist challenged the built up of theory around the concept equilibrium and social order. Increasingly, it was felt that the observer tends to observe according to an unconsciousness and simultaneous process of internal analysis. The ignoring of history became an issue as it became apparent that no society is without a history. Historical documents, life histories, narratives, and the verbatim statements of the observed became more and more a part of the observed data in order to overcome the subjectivity of the observer. Instead of logic, the role of institutions become more recognized in the process of scientific observation. Dan Sperbe's comment on intuitive understanding. Box 2.3 Dan Seffer's comment on intuitive understanding. Sperber said that the knowledge that is acquired in the field is brought home as loads of data in the form of field diaries, films, recorded interviews, field schedules, maps, historical documents, life histories, pictures, and genealogies. But along with it is the intuitive understanding that a scholar acquires into this field areas by his or her long exposure to the culture. It has been recognized that to get an intuitive understanding, a researcher has to spend a long time with the people or situations to be structured. By the time the work is complete, along with the factuals or material data, the scholar acquires an empathetic understanding by which he or she starts to understand the world through the eyes of the people he has spent time with. Things that appear strange in the beginning started to fall in place. While presenting the data, the social scientists then recast it in the mold of general level of conceptual understanding shared across the discipline and trade an intermediate path between the intuitive understanding that is purely personal and in the interpretations of data that presents this understanding in the form of a general conceptual framework. What remains important is that just the collection of data or more observation does not serve the purpose of understanding. What makes the crucial difference between a good work and a mediocre one is the level of intuitive understanding that a scholar can bring to the data. One important decision of collections of material for analysis is that in spite of one's best effort, it is not possible to see and observe each and everything in the field situations. Scholars who believed in the scientific and objective nature of their work, abstracted from the particular to the general, and concluded that there exists the homogeneous society. In this sense, what was being said was mean for the entire society as a whole. To a large extent, such method is followed even today, but attempts were made to identify the diversities within groups and cultures. Therefore, everything that thus follows a set pattern is not assumed to be deviant but diverse. A method often used of the statistical frequency does not always yield results that are true representations of the situations. A statistical frequency observed yields only a result, the causes of which have to be deciphered by more quantitative and intuitive deductive analysis. Let us take, for example, the societal data, the statistical data regarding sex ratio. A mere statement that there are many missing women in Indian populations does not well even in the beginning of a story of human marginalizations and tribalism in male dominated societies. Moreover, even an attempt to go into causality does not lead to uniform causes of the same phenomena. Thus, the neglect and even willful killing of female children and even adult women has many deep stated and immediate causes, and not all stem from tradition. In fact, the alarming fall in the sex ratio as in India is getting more and more modern, and goal has been many scholars to look for causes not in the past but in the present itself. In most societies, no matter how small or confined, many voices exist one day to a day. Life people do not act according to already laid down scriptures. The normative is often expressed in words but not followed in deed. Even the normative is being constantly manipulated and modified, as Barth but has this in his book Cosmologies in the Making. The person who has the respiratory or of oral knowledge has also the meaning to modify it. Thus, oral traditions transformation themselves as they pass from mouth to mouth and from generations to generation and travel across the space and time. Another kind of activity of digressions may be simple individual convenience of exigency. Most of us are familiar with such adjustment in refusal, rituals and performance of daily life and even life cycle activities like marriage. A third part of education may be deliberate, as act of deliberations of defined such acts have been understood under the label of contra culture and often refers to the acts of residents of marginal groups in society like women and the underprivileged. 2. Managing diversities in social research. While collecting data for sociological research, we need to recognize that diversities have to be both accepted and also explained in terms of meanings they express. Social science observations are time consuming and requires painstaking sincerity in recording data. There is no shortcut if one wants to get a real understanding of social phenomena, for all such phenomena are complex and have multiple causes and effects. As Holmeswood and Stewart 1991 explained it, when explanations in the social sciences becomes problematic, one has to accept rather than ignore or reject them. More of the research in a perfect explanation is also illusionary, and one has to accept that human beings are creative and have freedom of expression. This is again not to say that no regularities can be observed or no generalizations can be made, for if this were so, there would be no social science possible. The social scientists often tread a delicate balance between regularities that are real and those that one would wish to impress upon one's data. This is the classic duality between structure and action that has to be faced in social sciences. You can argue that the wider the applicability of our generalizations, the more we lose out on ground level explanations of particular events. The general often remains an essential condition for explanations of the specific. There is still another problem that empirical observations and interpretations have to deal with. What do we do when certain things that seems to lie beyond our own sensory perceptions appear to be well within the sensory perceptions of others, or at least that is what they claim? How do we interpret it when we are told in the field by our informants that they see spirits on a regular basis, or they conserve with the dead as they converse with the living, or that they have spouse and children in the other world with whom they communicate all the time? Box 2.4, the Sayora example. The Sayora, a tribe of Orissa, do not observe a division between the dead and the living. According to them, the dead have simply gone to live in another place quite near to their own place of residence. They meet on a regular basis and converse. The Soras, this poses no problem, and they often talk about a person they had met while gone to the field or to the market. But the only problem for the social scientist would be that the person is long dead. They also have their spouses and children in the spirit world with whom they keep in constant touch. How does one explain the Sora example given in the box 2.4? If one should follow the scientific rationality of relying only on one's senses, then the only way to explain this would be to either say that everyone in this culture is suffering from hallucinations or is speaking lies. Another way of explaining this would be that people of different cultures have different cognitive abilities and can actually see things that we cannot. This would be something like the work of Castaneda, that went beyond the credulity of many but was accepted accepted by many others. A third way to explain it would be that there are culturally learned mechanisms of deriving meanings from some optical and other sensory perceptions that elude us. For example, while working with a mountain community, I was told that when a person was about to die, a lama was called in to observe the passage of escape of the soul from the body. I asked the obvious questions as to how did a lama observe such a phenomenon, and was answered by equal incredulity as to why should he not. Thus, what is incredulous to us may be very obvious and commonplace to another, but if it stresses the limits of our credibility, then what is to be done? Ivan Pritchard, on the other hand, explained the phenomena of witchcraft among the Azande by introducing the entire experience to a positive one, and subjected it to a rational positivist functionalist analysis. Here he ignored the apparent subjective experience of the actors and concentrated on the overt or even covert functions that are performed by the experiencers. He took them as given conditions without comments. To the analyst, it does not matter what the Azande felt emotionally or experientially about witchcraft. The analyst focused on the role that witchcraft played in maintaining the social order. In yet some other cases, the analyst may concentrate on the meaning that these experiences have for the actors, and then integrate the individual experience into webs of significance. This is the approach taken by Geertz, but most scientists have skirted the issue of truth of experiences and of the seeing and experiencing of the actors. Some more recent scholars have not shirked the issue of sharing in the experience of the actors in the field situation. For example, in one instance, Sachs, who participated in the performance of the Pandava Leela in Garhwal, recounts being transported into an another other than ordinary experience while participating in the dance. One more dimensions about the study of culture is the relative importance of the verbalized behavior and the non-verbal one. Scholars of culture have often equated culture with language, prioritizing the verbal over the non-verbal by the logic that human beings are more into verbal communications and that non-verbal behavior being more natural is the realm of animal rather than human behavior. Yet another category of scholars, such as Ingold and Gell, has looked upon the culture as a way of engaging with the world, and the manner of this engagement is a dialectic relationship with the environment. Human beings engage with their environment, forming their own interpretations as a result of this interaction, and not the other way around. In other words, we do not always interact with a culturally created environment of meaning, but that our physical interactions that are natural to begin with the imbue the environment with meaning that then becomes transcribed into it. Such meanings, in the absence of the written records, may be only partly passed down and partly recreated each time an individual engages with his or her environment. Thus, as a child born into a hunter gather group learns about the environment by walking in the forest, by trying to satisfy hunger by plucking fruits and catching animals, and trying to survive and find its way around. An illustration of such a work is Nisa, the life and words of a Kungwan, which deals with the real life of hunter gatherer woman who lived in the bush, and that was recorded by Shostak. The lengthy section on managing diversities in social research takes us to the subject of understanding the basic goal of one's research. Let us discuss this issue in the next section. 2.11 Problematizing the object of study. We need to be prepared to problematize the object of our study. How do we understand the basic goal of our study? How do we conceptualize the society and culture? Unlike the unnatural sciences, we do not have anything concrete in front of us that we see as society or culture. What we do actually is to infer it from our observations and our assumptions. The process by which we can infer can become quite fussy and debatable. For example, one way is in which one can refer to society as one's object of study is by its geographical definition. For example, Malinowski studied in 1922 the Trobriand Islanders as a unit of study. Mead studied in 1922 Samoa. Radcliffe Brown carried out his major research in 1922 among the Andaman Islanders, and so on. One would presume that each of these exotic locations also contains a unique culture. The society can also be defined in terms of some of other boundary, say of marriage. Thus, a castle of caste or jadi can be defined by the boundaries of endogamy. There can be other criteria of membership as well, but now all units have such boundaries. Say, if one wants to study a religion like Hinduism, the field would appear vast and unbounded. Sometimes that one wants to study may not be defined in one location. Say, a diaspora of an immigrant group that cannot be studied with the reference to one location only. Even when one is bound to a location, the social phenomena need not be bounded. Thus, one cannot study a village in a rural India without understanding the effects of mass media and national politics on it. Increasingly, the availability of a bound society is being questioned, and we have a technique such as multi-sited ethnographies and networks to replace the earlier concept of a system. Often the term society is reduced to a subjective rather than an objective unit. A society or a community is one because the actors or participants define it as such. Thus, the simple way to study Hinduism would be to study those who call themselves Hindus rather than trying to devise an external definition for it. A culture could thus be the maximum amount of shared representations about the world that exist across unit we call a human group. Often, such a group, by the very fact of sharing representative representations, is defined as a society. Such sharing of representations or culture is not rigid. It transforms and diffuses and transplants itself. While studying a unit of society in India and saying among youth, we cannot overlook the influence of various cultures, including that of the USA and Japan and so on. Here, the task would be to separate the imposed form of original, but even such a task may become very complex, as one must have take into account the historical development of ideas and interpretations of the world. In the more conventional sense, under guidance in the constitutions of society mentions the following two primary senses of the concept of society. First, the generalized connotations of social associations or interaction, the standard definition that is given in the classroom of a network or pattern of interactions between social actors. To a relatively bounded unit of social relationship, forming a system of interdependency that distinguishing it from other such systems. This was the manner in which the societies were distinguished in classical times. But today, such bounded units are hard to locate and define, and increasingly it is being realized that such units may have always been an anthropologist's wishful thinking. What does a social scientist look for while trying to find a unit of studies to be defined as a society? In some case, one may look for the boundaries of linguistic understanding so that it become synonymous with a culture, or it may be a self-defined tribe or caste or a geographical unit like a village. However, what problematizes society is its original dissociations from the individual by Durkheim. The social scientist in the field has to interact with and observe individuals and not society. If the individual is seen analytically opposed to society, then to make sense of one's finding, a social scientist would ignore the actors altogether and create one's own versions of the structures through a process of abstraction. But if society is the product of the process of theorizing, then, like all other theories, this is contextualized in time and space. What is society then becomes itself a social activity subjected to rules of power. Take, for example, the manner in which Indian society was defined in the colonial era by the colonial administrators with the help of social elites or India, like the Brahmins and rulers. The version of India's society and history that has thus constructed prioritized both Brahmanism and patriarchy. Periodically, the constructions are not mere abstractions, but if created by a source of power, they translate themselves into reality, and thus as social historians have been able to demonstrate, colonial rule did not reconstruct India's society into the form into which the colonials had imagined it. But in spite of this reconstruction, there was a reality about society that never made it to the official version. Much later, subaltern historians made attempts to salvage this history. 2.12 Conclusion. Return to good old empirical approach. Considering the various problems encountered in trying to make sense of the data collected, we keep coming back to the sanctity of the term empirical reality while dealing with the terms of society and culture. The greatest tensions lies in the relationship between the individual and society. The theoretical disparity remains for us to revolve regarding whether we accept the positive school which admitted an extense of society over and above that of the individual, or we merge the two into a subjective post modernist interpretations. The status of the text as a documentary document of the status of the text as a document of reality or as a script for the subjective interaction or of the observer and the observed is still a subject of debate. Even if we take the later stand that all reality is interpretative and a form of reflexivity, then also the guide for successful representations of data would reset in the truthfulness of the representations. In fact, those advocating for the later approach echoes the positivists of imposing their own rules while systematizing the idea. In other words, things have been distorted to fit into neat compartments, whereas the reality is never so neat. Those who had talked about regularities and systematic patterns overlooked the validity of the irregular. In fact, the definitions of regular and irregular were tailor-made to fit into the preconceived notions of the observer. What ultimately emerge are the preconceptions of the observer neatly and systematically validate by selectively presented data. Foster 1965, restudying the village of Yucatan, accused Robert Redfield of being harmony and school order, where the reality was fought with suspicion, disharmony, and covert conflict. The only way is to keep as close to the observed reality as possible, to act as a mediator rather than an interpreter of data. The present genre of social scientists, especially, who's dealing with the field realities, prefer to stick as close to the narrative mode as possible, thus acting more as a translator on behalf of the actors in the field. The best mode is to assume that the knowledge lies with the actors and not with the interpreters, that society is what is the result of the interactions and activities of the actors as they engage with the world. The Durkheimian dialectic of the actor and the society is seen as more or less not valid just because society is no longer viewed as systematic, bounded reality of shared interpretations as positivist scholars held in earlier. There is also an attempt to view the things not only as they are, but also how they can be. They came to be. Thus, history has become an integral part of social science interpretation as well as power relationships and their formation. A part of power relationship is also the vantage point position of the scholar, the position for which he or she speaks and represents the world. It was increasingly felt that the subject positions of the scholar has been assumed to be white and male, thus othering all those who belonged to the third world, the black and the female. The word I used in many ethnographic narratives always evoked the male white scholar with his Western scientific relationality. For example, while almost all male white scholars looked at the world as patriarchal and male dominated, women scholars often found contracultures where women had their own modes and ways of countering male dominations and their own strength and voices. Contrarily, men often missed out on forms and manners of oppression that were visible to women. This is only one example. Others can be of studies of the caste system from the bottom up, studies of feminism from the perspective of black women, studies of indigenous people by indigenous scholars, and so on. Let us end our discussion in this unit by completing reflections and actions 2.2 exercise for working out the ways of dealing with the differences between the researcher and the researched. Reflections and actions 2.2. The following excerpts from Carlaker shows the theme of her research for women's voices. Read the excerpt and if possible read Kalka's articles itself and consider the possibility of yourself carrying out a research among the people of a socially marginalized group of society in India. In that case, how would you face the dilemma of facing the differences between your gender, class, caste, social status, and the consequences of unease at a personal level and the methodological assumptions of social sciences at the professional level? Write your answers to the questions on a separate sheet of paper and discuss the issues raised in the following excerpt while fellow learners at your study center. Except from Kalkar. When the end of the field work, I told my respondents that they had been of considerable help to me. Shanda, who had become quite a friend, said, "Babiji, आप तो अपनी किताब लिखते हैं, पर हमारा क्या होगा? Vivaji, you will write your book, but what will happen to us?" I had no honest answer to give her, just as I had not really been able to deal with the persistent questions of many women. भाभी जी हमें इससे क्या मिलेगा? भाभी जी, what will we get out of this? I rarely allowed myself to think too much about these uncomfortable questions during my visit to the colony. When I sat down to write my report, however, many images continued to flit through my mind. I was not always sure of how I should write about the lives of women I had spent days with. While I knew any act of telling to the interpreter in nature, I was nonetheless anxious to be true to my respondents' reality as was possible. I also knew that when those understudy were physically and mentally subjugated by society and by men, the moral overtones of a field worker's interventions and probing have implications of a different order. Inadvertently, one may be initiating a process of self-analysis, of consciousness rising among a group which has little hope of escaping from the bondage of daily life. The resultant frustrations and anger are in this case the direct responsibility of the field worker who becomes an agent of exploitation. Further reading, you can look at the discovery of grounded theory, and also the other book is The Idea of Social Science, Routledge, London. Okay, this is the end of the unit 2 named Empirical Approach. Thank you very much.